Hi everyone, thank you for viewing my presentation. For the last few years, I have been active as a community gardener, raising fruits and vegetables for the hungry in both Philadelphia and Iowa. In a previous course, I completed a risk analysis on food safety and community gardening. In other words, practices that will avoid the spread of foodborne illnesses like salmonella via produce. I had noticed that gardeners in sites where I had worked often did not follow recommended practices. This experience sparked my interest in learning more about how good food safety practices can be communicated to community gardeners, and therefore I decided to explore this topic for the project. My overarching goal is to conduct background research necessary to develop a framework for an effective food safety communications campaign to community gardeners. Let's briefly start with a few definitions. Community gardening is exactly what the words imply, with groups of people coming together to garden a small or large plot of land, sometimes for personal use, sometimes for harvest by the community, and sometimes for harvest by volunteers who donate produce to local food pantries. Some gardens have a specific focus on providing therapy, providing education at a school, or providing community economic development. You might not know there are over 18,000 community gardens in the United States. With the greater volumes of produce being harvested, stored, and transported for consumption by others, contamination of produce and spread of foodborne pathogens is an increased concern in community gardens. Pathogens can derive from the soil, compost, manure spread on fields as a fertilizer, droppings from wild animals, or humans harvesting the produce. Improper harvesting or storage practices can cause these pathogens to multiply. A series of recommendations called good agricultural practices have been developed by scientists to reduce foodborne illness. Many of these have to be adapted somewhat to fit community gardens. To commence my project, I surveyed currently existing communication materials related specifically to community gardens. Cooperative extension faculty in several states, or the outreach branch of land-grant universities, have developed fact sheets and garden manuals which present recommended practices. North Carolina State, in particular, shown here, was very rigorous and colorful. While I found these resources to be clear and highly informative, I questioned whether longer printed manuals, or even web manuals, would be effective for casual gardeners working in the dirt. Based on this gap in resources, I decided to focus my communication campaign on labels and laminated signs that can be affixed to permanent fixtures in the garden for quick, durable, on-site references. I went through the available research-based materials to pull out key messages that were highlighted in the majority of the publications in order to focus on these for my communications campaign. These included sanitizing buckets, best practices for cleaning the produce after harvesting, and recommendations for use of manure and collected rainwater in the community garden. Now that I identified the key messages, the goals of the communication campaign are to characterize current practices of community gardeners, to share these distilled messages with its target audience, to distribute garden-friendly communications products, and to eventually evaluate changes in gardeners in their food safety knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors due to the campaign. A key part of my preparatory research was an examination of the larger societal and regulatory context surrounding communication of this issue. The good agricultural practices on which many of the recommendations are based are also a key part of the new federal regulations under the FSMA, or Food Safety Modernization Act. FSMA will impact commercial farmers who meet specific sales criteria and limits activities like the use of raw manure. There has been significant backlash by the organic farming community, with the sense that the new specifications go against traditional practices and add an undue financial burden. Since the local farming movement has tight connections to community gardening in many areas, it will be important to consider the community's potential negative attitude towards these practices. In addition, I conducted a literature search with the focus on topics like the dissemination of information between gardeners and preferred garden information sources. I examined in particular the role of master gardeners, who are volunteer gardeners trained in horticulture by extension, in sharing information in the community. I identified a common theme of a local focus, with gardeners relying on sources in their immediate community or garden for information, and local clusters of community gardens functioning to share information. The next piece of my work was my own research in order to better understand the nature of the needs, preferences, and motivations of my target audience of community gardeners. I started with a web-based survey of gardeners to provide a needs and baseline assessment. In other words, are community gardeners currently following recommended practices? I found that the gardening audience was diverse, consistent with the literature, and that cultivation practices varied. Interestingly, the majority of gardeners surveyed did not follow the extension recommended harvest practices. I also began to examine communication practices in gardens, and in my small sample, I found that community gardeners most frequently received training on site in groups. I also gained useful knowledge from the survey about vocabulary that resonates with the target audience, including words such as fresh, healthy, outdoors, and productivity. In the future, a survey with a more defined surveyed population would allow for a greater extrapolation of results to the larger population. For the second part of my own research, I connected with community garden supervisors from around North America via the American Community Gardening Association listserv, as well as a specific connection I made with a local food specialist in Nebraska. The goal of the online interviews was to examine the communication patterns, organizational structures, and information sources used by our target audience. The results revealed high variability in the level of garden structure, with some gardens requiring the use of signed contracts, and others having few, if any, rules. Diversity extended to the flow of information in these gardens, which we can view through the lens of organizational communication. Most gardeners interviewed reported top-down structure, but some gardens clearly had a bottom-up collectivist structure. While nonprofits, national organizations, and extension were mentioned as information sources by many gardeners, one interviewee passionately described the anti-establishment, anti-scientific expert nature of her garden. I identified an undercurrent of the importance of local and traditional gardening knowledge, which we might label as community wisdom, that is important to address in my communications campaign. I used my literature search and survey research to put together an audience analysis of my target audience of community gardeners, which is diverse in demographics. Previous studies have outlined the motivations of community gardeners, which include connecting with nature, developing personal interests and self-esteem, and increasing sustainability. As I've referenced, the target audience seems somewhat split between more established, structured sources of knowledge, like extension, and a more collectivist view of wisdom, with a respect by perhaps both groups of locally relevant and locally generated knowledge. In order to structure the communications campaign, I believe it would be most effective to employ a two-pronged strategy with both top-down and bottom-up communications. The former would tap into networks of community garden coordinators and connect with influential volunteers in the gardening community, such as master gardeners, who may be more interested in obtaining specialized training to become food safety experts. The latter would employ a grassroots campaign strategy to encourage sharing of communication materials and food safety messages between gardeners at the highly local level. For implementation, the communications campaign will employ durable, laminated, simple graphics that can be distributed in the garden. Here's an example of a graphic that would be used on a bucket to remind gardeners of the procedure to sanitize the bucket before harvest. The language focuses on the green motivation of community gardeners, and the colors and style of the different graphics will be kept consistent in order to develop a brand. Based on the preferred vocabulary of the target audience, I suggest something along the lines of Wholesome Harvest as the brand name for this community garden food safety campaign. Here, outline some key elements to consider in the implementation of this campaign. These include the connection to Master Gardeners as a link to the information and resources of Extension, a connection with national organization resources like the American Community Gardening Association to develop brands, the development of the grassroots campaign by focusing on gardener-friendly language, and the use of accessible, available messages. I would also like to integrate a version of the collaborative learning that we discussed in the course into the campaign. This would include the opportunity for community gardeners with their cultivation expertise to interact with scientists and regulators in order to jointly examine the efficacy of the current recommended practices in real garden settings. After development, communication products would be pilot tested in focus groups and shared in pilot sites. Finally, I want to tie things together by examining how what I learned in this project connects to our studies across the semester. While I found the survey results to be instructive, I see the potential role of a qualitative observational research study like the one in our first assignment. An observational study of gardeners could reveal both practices and communication patterns that are hard to identify without bias in a survey. Our studies of collaborative learning help me appreciate the possibilities for citizen engagement and citizen science, which I feel could be particularly useful here, especially in examining the applicability of good agricultural practices to the specific community garden setting. Our studies of organizational communications in the course were fascinating to reflect upon here, as community gardens function as their own small-scale organizations, with different communication structures and practices, but also some commonalities and vocabularies that I identified. My studies of FSMA and my online interviews reminded me of the role I would be playing as a communicator coming into the situation with the science background and orientation. In order to be effective, I need to be a border crosser, and I think my own personal experience as a community gardener would help me with this. And finally, this project helped me reflect on the time involved in doing the groundwork for the effective communications campaign. All of this well before the implementation phase even begins. Thank you for listening, and thanks to the many community gardeners who graciously participated in my study.